actually, when I looked at it from the point of view of the year of the Arab being 618 rather than 621 or 622, it actually does line up, and it suggests
I would say
battles. Just to finish, is that the battles seem to go from Basra and then northwards, and that fits in with what you just said about that area, Qatar and so forth. But that's where they seem to be rising up from.
They're right, yeah, and they're kind of rising. They're using this power vacuum that's left after Khosrau's death, but also before. I mean, during the war, but especially after this power vacuum that's left, sort of by what was once the Sassanid Empire, and also Heraclius's weakness. Yeah, good. There's multiple rulers, and some of them are fleeing to into the east.
Yeah,
and what have you. But I think it's 622, and we have prima facie evidence for this. Good, it might not have initially been unanimous, like the date of Umar's death. You know that these type. It's like, when was Christ born? Who knows? You know, we now call it, you know, the year 1 or something. Good, we know it's not historical because, you know, Herod was dead, and Judea hadn't yet become a province of the Romans, which is the only time there would be a census taken of who's living.
It might be depending on which group as well, from their perspective. Like, for example, World War II, you know, some would say it's when Germany invaded Poland. Maybe the Americans might say, well, it's really 1941 because that's when they got involved.
Yeah, for the Americans, the World War II is from 41 till 45, and
yeah.
You know, so, and if you go to the Netherlands, they talk about 1940 to 45.
Yeah. So you might be dealing with that whole year of the Arab or the Hijri year, even though that's
Well,
kind of it seems like it could be a reflection of that, and eventually at some stage in the future it was consolidated, or there was a consensus formed. But
yeah. But what we do see, we have first-hand evidence, and I think so. We have these reports in the Arabic tradition about the first fitna, and I think, you know, this is what you often find when you gain your independence. Okay, good. Now we're independent. We've got rid of the evil colonial rulers, so to say. But who's going to run the show? So, you know, independence is usually welcomed by a bloody civil war. And there seems to be no exception. But just to share the screen with our friends from Islamic Awareness again, we have this inscription from the Greek inscription from the Baths of Hamad Gadr, 42 AH, 662 to 663 AD.
Yeah.
And when we look at the thing, we have it in Greek. Epi Abdallah Ma'avia. Here we find Ma'avia, not Muawiyah, or Ma'avia.
Yeah.
Amir al-Mu'minin. And then he goes on and discusses other things. So in the days of Muawiyah, of the Abdullah, Muawiyah, Amir al-Mu'minin, Amir al-Mu'minin, the commander of the faithful, the hot baths of the people were saved and rebuilt by Abdullah, the son of Abu Hashim, the governor. Good, then it's the dating. The 5th month of December of the 2nd day of the week in the 6th year of the indiction. These are the Byzantine tax cycles. They're usually 7 years.
Yeah.
In the year 726 of the colony, which is how one dated the provincial inscriptions in the Roman era, Kata Arabas, 42, for the healing of the sick under the care of Ioannis, the official of Gadara, and Ioannis is probably a Christian. But here it says, blah, blah, Hamad Gadar, cold and hot springs, Byzantine spa, the restoration of the bath, written by a Christian.
Yeah.
Clear. sign of the cross at the beginning, perhaps the earliest purely Greek inscription with in Palestine with the Hijra date. Good. Is it good? They have.
This is good confirmation that there was 622 was certainly used by some of the Arabs. They had a different.
Well,
do you think that's Heraclius? The Heraclius connection is the reason. Is it because that Heraclius was their hero, and that's why?
No. I think something different is happening here.
Yeah.
So it's the year 42, which is, we know this from the year 726 of the colony, because the indiction years are difficult. But 726, so it's doubly it's correlated.
Yeah.
And it's year 42, and we find this here, Kata Arabas, according to the Arabs.
Yeah.
Now, this is interesting. This is really interesting because it's not the year, strictly speaking, the year according to the Arabs, because it's the year of the Hijra, when Muhammad supposedly had to leave Mecca to go to Medina.
Yeah.
And then you have the Muhajirun, which which go with him, and the Ansar in Mecca who welcome him. But of course, the Ansaris, elsewhere in Arabic, this refers to the
Nazarenes, helpers.
Pardon?
Not Nazarenes or helpers.
The Ansar refers to the Christians, the Nasara, in Arabic, and helpers. That seems to be a bit of a Arabization, because we would expect not Zara and not Natsara in Arabic. But and the Muhajirun, the guys who went on the exile with him. Well, Hajara, to go into exile, it isn't a meaning that we find elsewhere in Semitic. Arabic isn't much help here, because we don't know anything about early Arabic, and we only have it from later periods, and there it's been heavily Islamified. But when we look at the other evidence we have for this, we have it, for example, in Syriac, where they refer to this in this month of Iyar, in the 75th year of the Le Sultana de Arab, de Tayaye, Sultana de Tayaye. That is the year of the Arabs. And there we find in a colophon, we find here the, where we have that, Le Sultana de Mahagriye, here. Le Sultana de Mahagriye, and here again we find Le Sultana de Tayaye. It's always talked about the year of the Arabs. Here we find it, de Mahagriye, and then the Bene de Yishmael, here, the sons of Ishmael, who is the son of the Bar Abraham here. So we find it here. But the interesting thing is this Mehagriye, which is, of course, what we find here with the Kata Arabas. It's the same thing. Nearly the Sultana is the rule. So Sultan in Arabic is a loan word from Syriac. But here it's according to the Arabs. This is what we also, as I said, find in Syriac text. But this mihagriye, and there the interesting thing here is the Sultana, so year 63 of the rule, the Sultana of the Arabs, the sons of Ismail, who are the sons of who is the son of Abraham, right?
Yeah.
So we see what we talked about last week. But mihagriye here is a term for the Arabs, which is related, of course, to hijrah in Arabic. And these are the Hagarites. And the thing is, when we look at the Greek texts, of course, if you wanted to say in Greek, this is the year of the exile, or the exile, the hijrah, or even of the exile of Muhammad, you could have said that. And I mean, you don't need to be a scholar of Homer to know which word you have to use, do you? What is the Greek word to go into exile? One of the Greek words you could use, everybody knows.
Exodus? No.
Exodus, yeah. Could have said to exodu or something.
Yeah.
It would have also worked, something along those lines, that they use according to the Arabs. And then here in Syriac, we find mihagriye, and we talked last week about the Hagarites and Hagar and Ismail and all of that. The point merely being that hijrah here would seem to refer to the Arabs, so originally. And this was the year when the war between Rome and Persia started. What did the Arabs do? Well, it might not have been, but this is when they thought, or when they placed the beginning point of it.
Yeah.
And which was 622. And it has nothing to do with the year of the exile, because what is interesting, we saw in this added part of the Zuhair inscription, they talk to Arbawa Sanat Arbawa Ishrim. In the Arabic text of Muawiyah, they mention the year without the dates. And what is interesting is that when you look at the other texts in Arabic, there is no unanimity about what is being counted, because if you see this here, we have the Min Mulk al-Arab, from the kingdom of the Arab kingdom, and in here, and elsewhere we find what do we find here? Usually what we find is we've seen they don't mention what is being counted. So like in this milestone of Abd al-Malik, in the month of Sha'ban of the year 85, in the month of Dhul Hijjah of the year 87. So they usually don't mention what is being counted, also on these lamps and other things. What we find in, this is from the thing of Taif. What we then find here is in some papyri from a bit later, we find here Sanat al-Qadda, which is same as the Hijra dating, but it's all of a sudden the year of the judge. We find elsewhere where they talk about the Hijra al-Arab. But it was never the Hijra of the Arabs, the exile of the Arabs. It was always the flight of Muhammad. I'm just trying to find where this might, where I might have mentioned this. I can't find it right now. But the point is that they either in the Islamic tradition, they either date it with not mentioning what's being dated, it's self-understood apparently.
Yeah.
Or they date it according to the year of the judge, it's a papyrus from Egypt. Or they talk about the Hijra al-Arab, which the exile of the Arabians or something, but it was never all of the Arabians because it was only the Muhajirun. But the Muhajirun here would then be the Arabs. So I think here what we're talking about is that Muawiyah is the first ruler who, after the fitna, which precedes this, is when the Arabs use this war against use this war between the Romans and the Byzantines to.
Do you mean the Persians?
The Persians and
the
Romans. And the Romans to and sort of good. So in 661, approximately, he takes over. So there is a bit of a civil war going on previously, and they use the, because if you look at the other systems of dating, the year of the province is clear, but the Romans, they would date from the year of the founding of Rome.
Yeah.
Greeks would, the pagan Greeks would either date from the first Olympic Games when nobody really knew when they happened, in the year of the 59th Olympiad. Okay, well, it depends, and this is what you're referring to, 618 or whatever. People were unclear when the first Olympic Games were held. Or the destruction of Troy, the Homeric epics. And even the Greek Christians would date from the creation of the world, the Animundi. Yeah. Good. There was a calculation for when that supposedly happened. But so there were some dating systems where, in effect, where people were unsure exactly when you started counting. So this is what you're referring to. But it seems clear that by the time of Muawiyah, and here he's into the third year of his rule, fourth year, that by then it had sort of become established as 622. When he talks about Kata Araba, stating according to the Arabs, he is not referring to an exile here, clearly.
No.
And as I said, the Syriac evidence of the Shanat le Sultan de Mihagriye, and the Mihagriye is a well-known term in Syriac. You find that in Greek too, the Magaroi, referring to Arabs. You have the Tayeye and the Sarakenoi, the Saracens. So you've got a number of terms referring to Arabs.
Yeah, these are synonyms, essentially.
Basic synonyms, yes.
Yeah, so if we take the 622 as their year, and the 628 is when they really go for it and they're battling up the Iraq. When Heraclius started really going for it with the Persians, and the Persians are preoccupied. You can imagine from 622 to 628, the Arabs are going on excursions and they're having mini battles, not major battles, but this might be to represent that kind of gradual evolution towards 628 when they finally are independent or liberated or whatever you might use.
Well, yeah, but of course, when everybody's got when the major powers have their armies in the field, So, I mean, this happened in World War II, something similar, you know, that when everybody's off fighting in fighting the Germans, then you know, they've got no manpower to spare in the colonies, and trouble ferments. You know, when there's weakness, trouble ferments. And
well, there's a perfect example of it in Ireland during World War One. That was when the 1916 Rising occurred for that very reason. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, everybody was in Flanders, so there was nobody left to. Exactly. And they dated it, and you see, because there is a certain amount of overlap between, you know, in the official biography of, or the Islamic, I wouldn't say, but I should cease saying biography. It's more a hagiography of Muhammad, because a hagiography is supposed to be morally edifying, the life of a saint. And of course, for Muslims, you follow the example of Muhammad. And how do you know about this? From the Sirat. So the Sirat is qua genre a hagiography, not a biography by any account. And what you find there is that if you take roughly the traditional dating, you see a certain overlap, because in 610, when Muhammad supposedly gets his first revelation, Heraclius is recrowned emperor. In 622, Muhammad supposedly goes on the Hijrah, which it doesn't really mean that, even in Arabic, it's a technical term for leaving, in Spain with the Reconquista taking place. If you found yourself under non-Islamic rule, you had to go on the Hijrah back to Islamic rule. And in India, there's a technical term for certain people who live in a kind of exile. But and in Yemen, in the Yemenite legal terminology, the Madinat al-Hijra, that is a sanctuary. But the point being, good. Hajra doesn't mean, it means to be hot, it means another things in Semitic, but it seems to have been given this meaning to fit the story. But good, anyway, Muhammad supposedly goes from Mecca to Medina, but of course this is when Heraclius is going on his holy war, and he's leaving one city, Constantinople, to go to another city, Ctesiphon. Good, there's a number of other parallels there, but let's just take the major ones. The 628, around there, the Battle of Nineveh, when the Persians kind of lose it. This is the Battle of the Trench, when Muhammad supposedly defeats the Meccans, sort of the final victory. And 629, 630 is when Muhammad supposedly returns to Mecca. But this is, of course, when Heraclius returns the true cross that he's gone and picked up in Persia, and he returns it to Jerusalem, which was a major event in late antiquity, the major event. So we see a certain amount of Heraclius in this hagiography of Muhammad.
Yeah.
And so it's been later reinterpreted as to, what happened, like with the Romans, with Abu Ruba Condita, when the city was founded, and this whole stuff about Romulus and Remus and lactating wolves and the whole bit, which is also like the Rashidun caliphs. It's also a method to connect the mythical past with the historical present. And and this seems to be what happened. And as I said, this Hijra, the inscription of Muawiyah certainly shows it has nothing to do with Muhammad and nothing to do with the Hijra. And as we've seen with both inscriptions of Muawiyah, or Mavia as he's seen in Greek, and Mawiyah would imply that he was Aramaic and not. So as I mentioned, this Mahmad to Muhammad, it was Arabicized. From Mawiyah to Muawiyah, this is the also an Arabization of, they've made an Arabic form out of what was originally an Aramaic form. And it has nothing to do originally with the Hijra, or with an exile leaving Mecca and Medina. So we have, and there is nothing in neither of Muawiyah's inscription is there any Islamic content, or there is religious content, but nothing that would be exclusively Islamic.
Yeah. So we have then a situation where we have this totally different story, really, the historical story, and then yes, we have a few centuries later with this elaborate tale, with Mecca and Medina, and I suppose it's probably a story for another day in terms of the dynamics of how we got from that point to the other, in terms of how that story was generated. But certainly you got the plot points are provided by Heraclius, as it were. So if you imagine a screenwriter, a screenplay writer, they put down their plot points and then they fill in the content around those plot points. But it seems like Heraclius was one part of the framework of the story, as it were.
Heraclius is important.
Yeah.
Because after Heraclius's victory, he tries to unite the church, and he makes sort of basically the final effort. Because the church is falling apart, and you have you had in the 5th century, Saint Augustine off in Algeria, inventing the West. The guy who knows no Greek, and he invents basically the notion of the Trinity that we still have today. But of course, he knows no Greek. He writes an excellent Latin, which no self-respecting Greek would read. But so we see already in the 5th century the division between the Western and the Eastern Church starting to slowly emerge. This is one of the things that Heraclius also does after his victory. I mentioned earlier, he redesigns the provinces and what have you, reorganization. He gets Deloitte and Touche or somebody in there to management consultants or something. So the beginning of the end, let us say. And but what he also does is he gives up the fiction of Latinitas, of Latinicity. So he starts writing Greek, because until then, the Byzantines, the East, that part of the Roman Empire which was still working, but that we call Byzantine, but it was just the Roman Empire. They saw themselves as Oromai, Romans, but their coins and whatever, they kept a fiction of Latinicity going because we're the Roman Empire. But he gives up on this, and he starts using Greek on coins. And he also, because the Romans were an emperor and they had gotten rid of, in the remote antiquity, it's also an apocryphal tale with Tarquinius Superbus after the rape. They chase out the last king, the son rapes. And anyway, so they chase out Tarquinius Superbus, the last king, and then they become a republic. But even in the imperial period, after Augustus onwards, the emperor, he's also one of the 2 consuls. So they keep up this republican fiction. We just have an emperor, but we're still a republic. And Heraclius gives up on this fiction. He calls himself a Basileus, a king. Until then, they'd always been an imperator, which was translated into Greek as could be translated as a pantocrator or cosmocrator, and things like that. Yeah. But the point is, he gives up on all of this, but he also makes an effort to unite the church with his monothelitism, and then this monoenergetism, and then monothelitism. I think it's that way around. It's getting late. But what he does is he says, let's not argue anymore about the nature of the Godhead. Is the Father coexistent or pre-coexistent to the Son? All of this homoousos and all of this complicated stuff about the pre-existence of the Son, or was there a time when the Father was alone and he did not have anyway. But he goes, okay, let's not argue about this, but let's agree that all three members of the Godhead have the same energeia in the Aristotelian sense. Let us say they all drive unleaded petrol.
Yeah.
Or they all use the same fuel. They've got the same driving force, energy.
Yeah.
And this is a good compromise, and it's accepted by a lot of people, except for Sophronius of Jerusalem and the Pope in Rome, who's holding the western part of the empire, Spain and North Africa, keeping it in the Roman orbit under Constantinople. And they go, yeah, we don't really like the idea. It's a bit too vaguely formulated compared to Chalcedon, and it means the heretics can come back to church without repenting.
Yeah.
And sort of basically what Heraclius was proposing is sort of a don't ask, don't tell solution.
Yeah.
And then this gets rejected, so he reformulates it, and that is the monothelitism. And that's also rejected, and then he dies, and good, there's an interregnum, and then Constans II takes over, and he's not interested in theology, and he kind of says, Chalcedon or nothing, so if you don't like it, leave. But the point I'm just trying to make is that Heraclius is popular because with this monoenergetism and its subvariants, it means the Arabs can actually, because they would agree, okay, we don't believe in the sonship of Jesus being the Son of God, or the Holy Spirit doing whatever he did with Mary, but we can concur that Jesus has the same energeia as God, the God, Allah. That would work. And what is interesting, if you look in the Hadith, the only historical personage that you find mentioned in the Hadith is Heraclius.
Yeah.
And positively, because Muhammad, who's supposedly illiterate, is writing letters to Heraclius. But also it's mentioned that either Heraclius became a Muslim or wanted to become a Muslim but couldn't because his court wouldn't go along with it. But the point is, you get the impression that this has something to do with his monoenergetism, monothelitism stuff, that they could identify. He was one of theirs later.
Yeah.
They preserved this memory. So the Hadith does prefer, on occasion, it of course preserves some historical data, just not as the Islamic tradition would have it.
Yeah.
And I think this is why Heraclius is of crucial importance also for the rise of Islam, because you get, also when you look at the career of Muawiyah, later he supposedly undertakes a sea expedition to besiege Constantinople. I think that's rather apocryphal. But what's interesting is that even in the Islamic tradition, that as long as Heraclius is alive, he has really no problems with Constantinople. The problems begin for the Arabs, especially for Muawiyah, when Constans takes over. So in the latter part of Muawiyah's rule. And Heraclius is dead for a long time, but then the point is that Muawiyah has problems with the Romans after Heraclius. So maybe cut out that earlier bit. It was a bit sloppily formulated. Okay. But so that Muawiyah only has problems with Rome after Heraclius' death, or the Arabs only have problems with Rome after Heraclius' death, as long as Heraclius is alive. And this you see with the Hamad Gadar inscription, because as we saw here, but good, when he talks about the indiction years, which is the taxation cycle, and in year 736 of the colony, but he mentions his own system. But both of these imply that he's in some relationship with the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And this cross that is mentioned there, if he good Muawiyah, according to this Maronite Chronicle and elsewhere, does other, he's apparently crowned king, which is not Islamic. He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane and prays, and then he goes to the Church of the Ascension of Mary and prays, and not really Islamic things, but it's with the cross. So he must have had no real objection to it. As we said, the indiction years and the years of the province seem to imply that he's somehow in the Roman orbit still.
Yeah.
So he's not entirely opposed to the system. So, that is revealing to, so he hadn't broken away entirely. He was still at least part of the Commonwealth, you might say.
Yeah, yeah. And that might be part of the reason why the Arabs hold on to a positive attitude towards Heraclius for quite some time.
No, and also especially for the theological reasons that I just mentioned.
Yeah, yeah.
Because his attempt to unite the church by formulating the relationship between the members of the Trinity as vaguely as possible, so that everybody could somehow identify with it. That would have been, because if you look at what you find in the Quran, okay, good, you've got the virgin birth, but not the divine fathership of Jesus and a few other things, but you've got, he does. So you've basically got the birth narrative of the proto-evangelium of, what is it, Jacob in English, Jacques, which is what you find in the Gospel of Peter.
Is it proto-evangelium of James? I can't remember.
James. Yeah, James. Yeah. James. Sorry, the English word escaped me.
Yeah, yeah.
James, the proto-evangelium of James, which is what you find in the Arabic Gospel of Peter. And this ultimately goes back to the birth of Apollo, this story. This is what you find in Theognis of Megara and I think Xenophon, when they recount the birth of Apollo, and you find similar accounts in the cult of Adonis in the Greek world. Of course, Adonis, the word implying a Phoenician, a Semitic cult, and this whole theme of a prohibited pregnancy. Somebody gets pregnant who shouldn't get pregnant, and of course there has to be a good reason for this happening. And anyway, so this Adonis legend, but also Apollo, and that story, and then you've got a form, well, it's not exactly, but akin to adoptionism. But these are things that were ideas that were not uncommon in Middle Eastern variants or forms of Christianities in the period, and it was something that Heraclius's formulation was something everybody could go along with. Yeah,
that makes sense. I suppose there's one outstanding I could just imagine the objection to the overall argument is that Robert Hoyland has a collection of various sources from the 7th century, and they seem to give some hint of an outline of the Islamic story of, let me say, in terms of the reign of the caliphs and so forth. How would you respond to that? Are we dealing with documents that are soon to be the 7th century or later additions?
I think that Hoyland, Seeing Islam as Others Saw It, is it's a very useful book, but I'll give you, but there are two things, and I'll give you an example if I can find it quickly.
Yeah.
I should have it, be able to pull it up. But so first of all, the source, the Redaktionskritik, the editorial criticism, when the texts were written and who and what have you, is a bit lacking. So, you know, if you look at the Doctrina Jacobi, or even John of Damascus, where it seems that his John of Damascus's book on heresy is apocryphal, and the 101st heresy, to translate the Greek term a little bit non-exactly, is also apocryphal to that, because it's certainly the discussions involved in his book on heresies are not from the time of John of Damascus. They're from a century later, the content would strongly suggest. So it's attributed to John of Damascus, but it's later.
Oh, okay. Well, that's...
And so if you read the most recent critical edition from Louvain, they mention that in the foreword, and with good arguments. And some of and the Doctrina Jacobi, well, I think this is written towards the end of the 7th century, and it doesn't really say anything about it's not a first-hand eyewitness to the period in question. So
yeah,
the book it's very useful for collecting all the sources, which is a monumental endeavor, and it's important. It will remain an important book on account of that. It's just one has to go, that he has the texts all collected there. You have to go back and use the critical editions. And in this work, reading English translations, which a lot of English-speaking people like to do, doesn't get you anywhere, because you have to read the original texts. I mean, the Greek and the Aramaic, it's a pain in the butt to read, I admit. But you have to do it, because in some cases where Hoyland translates Muslims, if I remember correctly, in the text you've got Mehagriye or Tayaye or something like that, one of the Semitic...
Yeah, I think he does translate Tayaye as Arabs consistently.
Okay, good.
Which leaves out certain information. I suppose not that critical, but it does leave out certain things.
He translates it, so it was with Abdul Malik in the building of the Dome of the Rock, if I remember correctly, and one of the church fathers, what's his name? I can't remember his name right now, from the convent of St. Catherine's, but who writes a letter about it. And there Hoyland translates as Muslims, which is not exact. And then there are some, I'll just find it, in a letter of Athanasius of Balad, the Patriarch of Antiochia in the 680s, he prohibits the Christians from eating the sacrifices of the Mehagraye, the Arabs. And it's interesting that Hoyland tries to see, because the problem is, of course, that the Muslim Islam doesn't really have sacrifices, which is not what you would expect from a late antique religion, because sacrifice had gone out of fashion a long time ago, previously. And Sir Hoyland then makes the suggestion that it's halal meat, on page 149, that it's halal meat that's being prohibited. This is an attempt to insert later tradition into an earlier period. And if he's talking about you can't eat the meat of the sacrifices of the Arabs, it means these Arabs were sacrificing things. So this is this classical case of using the framework of Islamic traditions, plural, I use it purposely, to interpret earlier texts who probably were not aware of this tradition. And this is a huge problem that we have. And these are these things where we, in Sebeos, the Armenian text, where, as my predecessor Olich pointed out, it's a chronicle, and chronicles, every time they were copied, they were added to. And if you look at what happens before and after, this seems to be an interpolation by a later copyist. And so
we really don't have much in terms of sources that we can properly rely on unless we really critically filter out the.
Is that what happens in Islamology, which is a huge problem, which wouldn't happen in any other philological discipline, is that one uses the sources uncritically. So, for example, there is a debate in Old Testament studies with the Mesa stele and the Teldan stele. So Mesa is a Moabite stele that from what's now Jordan, the arch enemies of Israel in the times of when supposedly King David was conquering up his kingdom. And you have an Aramaic stele from later Teldan. And both seemingly refer to an entity called the House of David, but several centuries after David supposedly lived. But, and there are people that say, look, okay, good, so all you hypercritical biblical scholars, you're talking nonsense, doubting the historicity of David. No, they're talking to an entity of, we mentioned in Song of Songs 5:16, Dodi. It could also be that's the same, Dod is the same spelling as David in Old Hebrew. So it could be the house of the beloved or something, or the.
Okay, yeah.
But it doesn't, when you refer to House of David, it doesn't necessarily mean that the David of the books of Samuel are being referred to.
Yeah.
And you have the priestly blessing in Leviticus. They found it on a silver amulet in Israel that I think dates to the 7th century or something. And then you have some people that say, look, this is the proof the book of Leviticus was already around in the 7th century or whenever this silver amulet was made or inscribed. And you're going, no, it only means that the priestly blessing that is also found in the book of Leviticus was in use. So you have to use these, you can't use these sources to confirm a later narrative. You have to let these sources tell their own story. And not try to, because you have these one source, I can't have to look it up, but talking about a campaign led by a Mahmat with a tet, but at a period when Muhammad, according to Islamic tradition, was already dead.
Yeah.
Good. So
I think that might be Thomas Presbyter, I believe.
Thomas, yes, it is Thomas Presbyter.
Yeah.
So I just couldn't call up the name that quickly. But so it's in supposedly, if you believe it, I have my doubts, but 634 or something.
Yeah.
But it's not something that, it's like saying, okay, we've got a campaign of Napoleon after Waterloo. He certainly wanted to go on campaigns, but, on his island holiday resort, he didn't really get the chance. But the point being that one, and there's all types of explanations that people come up with, but the thing is that this contemporary evidence has to be used, methodologically speaking, to tell its own story and not to fit into a later tradition. As I said, in biblical studies, we've circumvented this, in classical studies. So when Mommsen, the great German classical scholar, so famous for his history of Rome, it's in German in 7 volumes, but when he got the idea to write this, and he wrote the first scientific history of Rome. But what did he do first of all? He collected the corpus, what became the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, all of the Latin inscriptions and got rid of the spurious ones and tried to date them and systematize them and what have you. And then he collected all of the coins. And what he found from the coins was there were a lot of spurious emperors that had been, ancient historians had kind of inserted, or they'd somehow gotten into the historiography.
Yeah.
And he kind of banished them to myth. So, and by collecting the prima facie evidence, the coins and the inscriptions, he could write a history of the Roman Empire that was based on sources, source-driven.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is where we're still a long way off in Islamic studies. So it's not anti-Islamic, it's not Islamophobic, it's not whatever. It's just historical research. And like with the inscription of Muawiyah, we have to let it tell its story and not try to fit it into a later tradition. And these later traditions, we discussed with the building of the Kaaba last week a little bit about that they are contradictory, because even with this so-called conquest of Asham, of Syria, in one source you have a general that comes from the south, and another source it's a different general coming from the north, what have you. Yeah. We're still a long way away from sorting out all of this this stuff, and so we have to let it tell the story it tells, and not try to put it on Procrustes' bed to make it fit into the later traditions.
Yeah. On that note, I think that's probably a good place to stop. Thank you very much, Professor Kerr.
My pleasure, and I hope it was interesting and useful, at least, and useful.